Hello and welcome to another good decision by the Governance Institute of Australia. I'm your host, Patrick Gallagher, and today I'm joined by Siobhan Toohill, Sustainability Advisor from Pure and Applied. Siobhan, thank you for joining us.
Oh, look, it's fantastic to be here and part of this conversation.
Quite an impressive resume, over 20 years of experience in sustainability, working with some of ASX top 50 companies. I did note that you were Australia's first Chief Sustainability Officer for listed financial services.
Yes.
Can you give me a bit of a background of where you came from and how you got to this position and where you are now?
Sure. Look, I mean, starting in this space, over 20 years ago, there was no kind of defined sustainability role in businesses at that time. And I think most of us who've been doing this work for a long time, we're doing work in all sorts of other areas. So I came into this space through green buildings and in the property sector. I moved into finance about 12 years ago. But what has happened in those 12 years, particularly in finance, has just been extraordinary. The pace of change, the developments in sustainable finance, the establishment of international guidelines, which I've had a front row seat to, and in fact participated in a number of those. It's been an extraordinary journey, and so much has happened in that time. So it's a really exciting time to be where we're at right now. That a lot of that work that for such a long time has been done voluntarily by hardworking teams, we're now shifting into a mode where it's now becoming much more embedded, integrated into how we do business.
We've been noticing a lot lately, particularly at recent conferences that the Governance Institute has held, that the talk about town is very much on climate-related disclosures and reporting. How can businesses and organisations get a grasp on these changes in this mandatory reporting?
Yeah, look, I think for large businesses, they've probably been thinking about this for quite some time, and certainly financial institutions have had some expectations from regulators in this space. But if you're a smaller organisation, or perhaps there hasn't been an expectation for you to be working in this space, there's a bit of work to be done, and you might need some support. But also, I would argue that you need to make it part of your business quite quickly as well. So think about how you do your financial disclosures, for example, and think about how do you bring your climate disclosures alongside your financial disclosures. So think about how you might make it part of the work of your finance team, but you might need some additional advice. You might even need some additional in-house capability to help you set that up. You might need to look to a sustainability manager, for example, to work alongside your finance team to build out that capability. But really what we encourage organisations to think about is how are you going to govern for this? So how have you ordinarily governed for environmental risks? How do you govern big decisions for your organisation? So think through that governance piece. Then think through strategically. What's your strategy? Why does this matter to your organisation? Think through the risks. And for many organisations, climate risk is quite significant. And under the new disclosures, there's some quite specific questions and reflections that you need to consider. And then, of course, you need to start thinking about metrics. And that's the bit that's probably going to be quite hard, I think, for a lot of organisations, and where quite a bit of work needs to be done. But importantly, just get started and dive in and start to grapple with what you need to do.
And I could imagine a lot of this, comes from the boardroom and leadership and decision making. So what does good sustainability and good governance around sustainability look like from a boardroom decision making perspective?
Yeah, look, fantastic question. And I think the first thing is that boards need to make sure that they've got the knowledge, that they are well educated. Now, they don't need to have deep expertise, but they've got to understand what their role is around broadly sustainability, and now specifically with the disclosures around climate change, and understand what they're expected to do in light of the regulatory reporting requirements. And so that might mean, as a group, doing some training as a team. It might mean bringing in an expert to run you through some workshops to build that expertise, but to ensure that you're all on the same page and you've got that common knowledge. I think importantly too, understand the science. So understanding the science of why this is important, as well as then understanding the implications for the organisation as well. And then, of course, like any good board, it's understanding what questions you need to ask of management, and asking management around what are the nature of the risks that the organisation will face into now, but over the longer term. What kinds of scenarios have we been assessing climate change risks against in terms of our strategy? And then understanding what does it mean for our customers on the ground? Looking through our value chains, what does this mean in terms of our supply chain risk, but also what does it mean in terms of the impacts for our customers? And then, of course, starting to think through then, what are some of the metrics we need to be on top of as an organisation, and engaging with management to understand What kinds of metrics are going to make sense? And then how are we going to track that? What information does the board need over time? And what might the board look for in terms of disclosure or reporting back up to the board so you can monitor performance over the longer term as well?
Absolutely. And you did mention it, a part of that is looking at the supply chain. Something I'm today curious about is when you look at Scope 3 emissions, how can organisations tackle that, particularly in what is a volatile global market and a complex market too?
Look, Scope 3 is really complex. So by Scope 3, we mean it's the emissions associated with your value chain. So for most organisations, that's going to be your supply chain. It might be your employees' commute to work. But for some organisations, like financial institutions, it's also what's associated with your customers as well. So it's complex. So you might need a bit of help to actually scope up what is Scope 3 for you. And you might even need some legal advice to give some clarity to that as well. But then the actual work of then assessing the data and collecting that data is not easy. And I think in the first instance, think about what sector your organisation is in. Is there some guidance for your particular sector around how you might approach that Scope 3 analysis? And you'll be amazed that there's a lot of information, particularly for different sectors, around how you tackle this kind of problem. So don't feel like you've got to just do it on your own and make it up from start. There's actually a lot of guidance that's available out there. Some of it international, some of it specific to Australian sectors as well. So that's a really good place to start. I think the other thing to keep in mind is you don't need perfectly accurate data for every single supplier today. It is reasonable to expect in the first instance that you'll be working with estimations or estimated data. But over time, you need to be able to demonstrate that you're improving that quality of data and that you'll be engaging with your suppliers more regularly to get more accurate data. We're all in this together and we're all learning how to measure, and so we can expect that the quality of that data will improve over time.
And we're looking at international standards. Do you think Australian organisations are up to the task of meeting reporting requirements, say under the ISSB global standard?
Yeah, so if you like, the ISSB standard is the overarching framework that countries are using around the world, and that's informed the way in which we've developed our standards here in Australia. Now, there's some differences, but the overarching framework is common globally. So I think that's really useful, so that we've got a degree of interoperability with other nations. That's really helpful, and particularly if your supply chains, customer chains are global, you broadly want to be kind of operating with the same framework. So that's helpful. Are we ready? Look, I think there's a lot of variability around readiness for this. I know that there were some companies that were waiting for the outcome of the recent election to determine whether they need to get started. And if you haven't got started and you're in Group 1, I think get a wriggle on. There's a lot of work to be done. But I think you've got to start working through what are the mechanisms by which you're going to collect that data. Technology is going to help us here, and I do think AI has got a role to play over the longer term, and we're seeing some organisations already working with that. There are a lot of providers, but as much as possible, look at the internal systems you have within your own organisation today. How can you work with those systems to collect the data from your customers and from your suppliers, rather than simply bolting something new on top of that? Really reflect around what are the existing mechanisms that you have and how do you integrate it in terms of how you collect information, data, financial data about your customers and your suppliers.
That's interesting about AI. How does that fit into the equation with data reporting and whatnot, and gathering?
Yeah, well, I mean, because a lot of this information in the first instance there'll be a lot of estimation, and if you're doing high volume transactions, it's going to be very difficult to get really accurate climate data. So you might be looking at estimations or mechanisms to assess what those emissions might be, and AI might be able to support you with that work. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. And look, obviously there's been some high profile cases around the globe and cases here in Australia, particularly with ASIC, looking at greenwashing and ESG and whatnot. When it comes to greenwashing, how can an organisation ensure that their sustainability reporting is credible and their sustainability claims are credible?
Look, this is such I think there's good intentions in this space, and some people have fallen foul, even though they've had good intentions. So it's fair to say our regulators are really tough and really quite focused on ensuring that organisations are making correct claims. And so the trick here is two words. Legally, it is that you've got a reasonable basis. Have I got a reasonable basis to sign up to this target? Have I got a reasonable basis to make this claim? And what that means is, have I got evidence? Have I got information, data, logs, board minutes that substantiate or set up why we think this is a reasonable basis to make this claim around this activity? If I'm looking at a particular project and how it's performed, and I want to make a claim around its sustainability performance, have I used a third-party tool that's got strong accreditation around it? So, for example, if I'm making a claim about a building and its environmental performance, have I used a tool like Green Star, which has got a whole raft of supports around it and a well-regarded body that manages that particular tool? That's the kind of thinking that we need to apply to this. Is there a reasonable mechanism that sits behind this claim that I'm making? Or if I'm making an assertion about my business, can I back that up? Is there good evidence? Can I be confident around that? Can it be really tested? These are the things that you need to think about. In terms of that data that you're using to support your disclosures, look, as I said, what's going to be really hard is the fact that you're going to be potentially using estimated data in the first instance. What's really important is to think through what's the methodology? How have I gone through the process of collecting that data? Have I gone through a reasonable basis to determine who all my customers are, what industries they're working in? Have I applied reasonable factors that are well substantiated by different organisations to help me land on what that information is? Yeah.
Fantastic. And when we look at net zero, how do you think Australian organisations are taking net zero seriously at the moment? Where are we sitting with all of that?
Look, net zero is one of those really complex areas, and we've seen lots of noise about that internationally as well. I do think a couple of years ago when organisations started making net zero claims, there were different approaches that were taken. Some just jumped in and said, yep, net zero, that's really important for my organisation. And there were others who said, I'm okay not being first. I really want to do the work and really understand what's it going to take for my organisation to get to net zero. And there, of course, there's various degrees in between as well. My advice to an organisation today that's thinking about signing up to a net zero target is do some work beforehand. Now, you don't need to have the complete answer, but you need to understand what are the different pathways that you're going to need to take to be able to land on net zero. So think about your own direct business, think about your customer chains, and really understand what are the particular pathways or roadmaps, each of those different areas that you are active in, what's it going to take to land on net zero by 2050. And then have a conversation at management, but particularly at a board level. Are we comfortable with that? Are we comfortable with the kinds of decisions that we might need to make around who our customers are or who our suppliers are, or what kinds of activities as an organisation we undertake? Do we think we'll be able to invest in that particular technology or make that particular change? Is this transition, are we ready to make these kinds of transitions? Or as we step through time, are we ready to take these steps? Do we have a reasonable basis to then commit to net zero and to then set the targets, the interim targets, that are going to help us get there over time as well? So yeah, quite a bit of work. I think approach it cautiously. Now, it's not a reason not to do it, but just be careful and be mindful around how you're going to get there.
And that's the key, isn't it?
Yeah.
And particularly looking at a governance perspective.
Correct.
And having that governance from the top down and flowing through the organisation and goal setting, and particularly with the board.
I think just to add, keep in mind, as a nation, we've committed to net zero. So actually, as a nation, there's an expectation there that we need to work towards net zero. So we've all got a role to play, but it's working through how you're going to get there and being ready. In a way, you want to remove the potential for surprises. So you've got that sense of what decisions you're going to need to make now, but longer term as well.
Do you think sustainability is a fiduciary duty for organisations, or is it a nice to have?
Look, I think when we reflect on the Corporations Act and the expectations around how boards need to manage for risk, for example, I think for most organisations, you could probably say that's getting pretty close, if not already, a fiduciary risk. And when I reflect on having worked in listed organisations and I reflect on the kinds of conversations I've had with investors, it's pretty clear that their perspective is that this is a fiduciary risk in their eyes. And if you're an organisation that's exposed to emissions-intensive activities, that's going to potentially have an impact when we factor in the price of carbon, Think about how your assets might be impacted around changing weather patterns. Are you exposed to drought? Are you exposed to heavy rainfall, cyclones? We've obviously seen recent climate-related or weather-related events on the east coast of Australia. Think about how that's increasing in activity and think about how that's going to impact your bottom line. When you reflect on that, more than likely, this is most certainly a fiduciary duty for your board. Yeah.
Wonderful. And another question I had was particularly around should the Australian government and Australia, should it be legislated around transparency for supply chain emissions and labour practices?
Yeah, really interesting to think about, do we legislate for that or do we use the mechanism of the Group 1, Group 2, Group 3 in terms of the requirement to disclose? So if you like, I think as we work through climate disclosure requirements, the data will become better as we work. Large organisations will begin, and then small organisations over time will be required to also report. And so they will need to have the systems in place to be able to supply that data as well. And I do think we need to give organisations, particularly small organisations, a bit more time to prepare. They will need to find the right resources and hopefully they'll be supported by their customers and suppliers who are larger to help them get to the place that they need to be in to do disclosures. I think, transparency is important, but I think we need to give people time to get there first. I think when it comes to the human rights and particularly the modern slavery perspective, again, we know that disclosure is helpful in terms of helping people understand the language and what's expected. But I do think the discussion that we're seeing certainly in Europe, and there's been some discussion about whether it's going to be mandated around due diligence, whether or not that lands in Australia. We had a review in Australia recently where there was a recommendation around a requirement for human rights due diligence, certainly for those organisations that are captured by the Modern Slavery Act. I do think a stronger expectation around due diligence, certainly by large organisations, will help drive some change. So it's really thinking about what will drive the change. Mm-hmm. Is it the transparency and whose responsibility ought it be? I do think larger organisations are probably better equipped, better resourced to make a start on this. And I do think due diligence, so being in a position where they've got to ask questions around where was something sourced from, what was that value chain, which countries, what kinds of high-risk sectors might be involved in producing that particular service or product. Larger organisations are probably better capable to ask those questions and then work with their supply chains to understand where those risks might lie.
Fantastic. And coming back to the greenwashing side of things and reporting around ESG, are the current restrictions tight enough to ensure that organisations don't fall into this position?
Yeah, I think, look, we've seen some pretty tough, not just penalties, but I think the bigger issue is actually from a reputation perspective when an organisation is called out for greenwashing. And so even though the fine might be small, the fact that your name gets splashed across the business pages is pretty tough. And I reflect on how different jurisdictions are handling this. The challenge is if we go too tough on greenwashing, we'll restrict innovation. And so I think there's a bit of a tension point around how tough are we? We certainly need to ensure that we don't see organisations making ridiculous claims or claims that are unfair when you've got some organisations doing the right thing and others kind of bending the rules a bit. We don't want to see that. And I absolutely agree that they should be called out and they should be fined. But where perhaps an organisation had good intent, they missed something, I think coach them, support them to make that change. We don't want to reduce the innovation. We don't want to see organisations limiting their ambition around sustainability. And I do think at the moment there is a bit of a risk of green hushing. That is, organisations being really nervous to talk about their sustainability credentials or their achievements, or they might have piloted an initiative with suppliers and customers around some wonderful net zero type initiative. But they're really nervous. Gosh, have we dotted every I and crossed every T around the claims that we're looking to make around this particular initiative? Perhaps get too nervous to talk about it. And I think that's a shame if we miss out on those opportunities. So we've got to strike the right balance here.
And how are Australian businesses preparing for the Taskforce of nature-related disclosures?
Yeah, so TNFD, or the Taskforce on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, was released a couple of years ago. We've seen a group of Australian businesses say that they are going to be early adopters, which is really exciting to see. I think we've also seen some companies not necessarily put their hat into the ring to say they're going to do it, but actually they're just quietly getting on with it because they were concerned about greenwashing risks, so an example of that. Really, it starts with understanding where does your business have a dependency on nature, and where do you have perhaps an impact on nature? So where does your business have a reliance on nature-related services? You might be reliant on pollination, you might be reliant on certain access to water, for example, that's a dependency. And where you might impact nature is where you might have a negative impact on nature. You might be impacting biodiversity in some way, and, if you're a mining company, for example. So these are the things that you need to think about. For large organisations, they'll think about the different sectors that they work with and think about where are those dependencies and where are those impacts. That's a really good place to start. And then reflect on what are the risks to your organisation if you can't access those nature-related services, or what are the risks associated with those particular impacts that you have. That's a good place to start. And I think also, in the same way that you're working through your climate planning, so what we talk about is often a transition plan. If you've made a start around your climate strategy, you're more than likely working through a transition plan. And you're usually thinking about, first of all, governance. Now, when you think about your climate governance, your nature governance is probably going to be pretty similar. So you might find that you're actually already doing some things in relation to TNFD or nature that you're doing on climate. And in fact, the more that you can marry up your climate work with your nature work to make sure that they're working together around these environmental risks and opportunities, that's really, really important. So don't just say, I've just got to get through my climate reporting now and I'll worry about nature later. Actually, just give a little bit of a start. You don't need to have all the answers, but just start hatching out where you can make a bit of a start on nature and start that conversation with your suppliers and customers and see where they're up to and how you can work together around this. Fantastic.
Well, look, that's all my questions today. Thank you so much for joining in on the discussion on what is our first episode of Another Good Decision. Siobhan Toohill, thank you so much for coming today. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much. I've really enjoyed today's conversation.